They ridiculed the human's frailty, until his sacrifice saved an alien Empress, the moment legends were born. The station was big enough to swallow cities. That was the first thing Ethan Cole thought, when the shuttle broke through the docking fog, and the full shape of Verith Station came into view. It hung in space like a small moon that someone had carved into 1,000 levels, each one glowing with a different color of light. Ships of every shape and size moved around it slowly, like fish circling something they were not sure about. Some of those ships were longer than most mountains back home. Ethan pressed his face close to the shuttle window and watched them without saying anything. He was 29 years old. He had a lean face, short brown hair, and a scar above his left eyebrow from a training accident 2 years ago. He was not tall. He was not wide. By the standards of the species he was about to stand next to, he was roughly the size of a medium houseplant. He knew this. He had read the briefing files 3 times on the journey over, studying the heights, weights, and physical capabilities of every delegation that would be present at the Grand Accord. He had made notes in the margins, in small, neat handwriting. He had folded those notes and put them in his breast pocket next to the photograph of his younger sister, Nina, standing in front of their house in Tucson in the summer sun, squinting into the camera and laughing at something off to the left. He had been assigned to the conclave at the last minute. The original security aide, a more senior officer named Carl Briggs, had been rerouted to deal with a flare-up near the Orion corridor. Ethan had gotten the call at 6 in the morning, while eating cereal in his quarters at the Earth Frontier Base. He had packed in 40 minutes, and been on a shuttle by 7. He had not complained. He had not asked for more time. He had simply packed, eaten the rest of his cereal standing up, and left. His role was junior diplomatic escort and security aide to Ambassador George Hadley, a large, serious man in his 50s who had spent 30 years working in alien relations, and who communicated mostly through eyebrows. Hadley had looked at Ethan when he arrived at the shuttle, and raised one eyebrow. Ethan had stood straight and said, "Ready, sir." Hadley had raised the other eyebrow as well, which apparently meant something positive, and that had been the end of their introduction. Also traveling with the delegation were Senior Aide Laura Vance and Communications Officer Danny Harper. Laura was sharp and quick, and always seemed to know what was happening in a room before anyone told her. Danny was younger, a little scattered, and had the specific kind of enthusiasm that made long journeys go faster. He was the one who had spent the entire shuttle ride telling Ethan facts about the Solican Empire that were technically in the briefing files, but somehow sounded more interesting when Danny said them out loud. "The Empress has 4 eyes, Danny had said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "But she only uses 2 of them during formal sessions. The other 2 are watching the room the whole time. She never misses anything." "That sounds exhausting," Ethan had said. "Probably," Danny had agreed cheerfully. The docking process took the better part of an hour. When Ethan finally stepped off the shuttle and into the receiving corridor of Verith Station, the first thing he noticed was the ceiling. It was so far above him that the top of it was hazy. The second thing he noticed was the crowd. There were beings of every description moving through the corridor. Tall ones, wide ones, ones that moved on 4 legs, ones that seemed to glide rather than walk. The air smelled like a dozen different planets at once, warm and metallic and strange in a way that was not unpleasant, just very foreign. The third thing he noticed was that he was being looked at. Not everyone, not in a direct pointed way, but as the human delegation moved through the corridor toward the main assembly level, Ethan caught the glances. The Vreth delegation passed them near a transit junction. 6 beings covered in thick, dark gray armor plating, the smallest of them a full head taller than Ambassador Hadley. One of them, a broad-shouldered figure wearing the insignia of a senior attaché, let his eyes move over the human group and settle on Ethan for a moment. His expression did not change. He just looked, and then looked away, the way someone might look at something they had already decided was not worth further attention. In the main hall, the delegations gathered for the first introductory session. Ethan took his position at the corner of the human table, standing, as his role required, slightly behind and to the right of the ambassador's chair. He stood straight, hands clasped behind his back, and watched the room fill up. The Sulacan delegation entered through the far left passage. They were tall and lean, moving in a way that was almost perfectly synchronized, like water flowing in the same direction. Behind them came the Empress Sci-Fi. Ethan had seen photographs of her in the briefing files. The photographs had not quite captured the way she filled a room. She was not the largest being present. The Duran delegates dwarfed her by a significant amount. But there was something about the way she moved that made the eye follow her. She wore layered silks that shifted colors slowly, cycling through deep blues and greens, and her four eyes were open and calm. She did not look at the crowd the way someone looks when they want to be seen. She looked at it the way someone looks when they are reading it. Her gaze passed over the human table. It passed over Ethan. There was no pause, no recognition. He was part of the furniture. Then the Vreth attaché, the one from the corridor, leaned toward the aide beside him. He did not lower his voice. He spoke in Galactic Common, clear enough for the nearest tables to hear. The humans sent a child made of paper. The aide beside him made a low sound that was the Vreth equivalent of a quiet laugh. A few other delegates nearby shifted in a way that suggested they had heard and found it at least mildly amusing. Ethan heard every word. He felt the heat of it in his chest for exactly 2 seconds. Then he breathed out slowly through his nose, fixed his eyes on a neutral point across the room, and stood straight. He had been the smallest person in more rooms than he could count. He had been underestimated by people who were bigger, stronger, faster, and more decorated than him. He had learned, over the course of 29 years, that the size of a thing and the weight of a thing were two very different measurements. He had also learned that the best response to someone telling you that you do not belong somewhere was to still be standing there when the room needed someone to act. So he stood. He watched. He kept his hands clasped behind his back. The session began. Nobody looked at him twice. Outside the station windows, the binary stars burned on in silence, indifferent and very old. The way stars always are before the things worth remembering begin to happen. They ridiculed the human's frailty until his sacrifice saved an alien empress. The moment legends were born. The days inside Vareth Station had a rhythm to them that Ethan learned quickly. Mornings were for formal sessions in the Grand Accord Hall. Long, carefully translated arguments about borderlines drawn across star maps that most people in the room would never personally visit. Afternoons were for smaller side meetings, corridor conversations, and the kind of diplomatic maneuvering that happened quietly and without record. Evenings were free, which mostly meant that different delegations retreated to their own sections of the station, and the hallways became a little calmer. Ethan used the free hours the way he always used downtime, working. He spent his first evening going through every corner of the diplomatic level he had access to, walking each corridor slowly and memorizing the layout. He noted where the emergency panels were, where the access junctions split off, where a crowd might bottleneck if something went wrong. He had done this same thing during every deployment of his 4 years in the 4th Frontier Ranger Corps, mapped a place before he needed to run through it. The habit had saved him twice before. He saw no reason to break it now. He also kept reading. He had already gone through the standard Sulacan cultural briefings twice, but there were extended files that most people marked as optional and skipped. Ethan did not skip them. He read about Sulacan greeting customs, about the specific way they used formal silence to indicate respect, about the old dialect still used in the Empress's home system that differed from standard Solican in small but meaningful ways. He practiced phrases quietly in his bunk at night, mouthing them without sound, the way he had once practiced weapons drills in the dark. Danny walked in on him doing this on the second evening and stood in the doorway for a moment. "Are you actually learning Solican?" he said. "The full briefing says it takes about 8 years to get conversational." "I'm not trying to get conversational," Ethan said. "I'm just learning what I might need." Danny considered this. "What do you think you might need?" Ethan thought about it. Something to say if everything else has already been tried. Danny had no answer for that. He sat down on the other bunk and handed Ethan one of the 2 cups of coffee he had been carrying. They drank in comfortable silence for a while. Laura, in the meantime, had become the kind of person who watched Ethan the way someone watches a puzzle they have not solved yet. She was good at her job in a way that was quiet and complete. She anticipated what the ambassador needed before he asked for it. She tracked the tone of every session and reported it accurately, and she never said more than she meant to. She noticed things. She noticed, for instance, that Ethan always touched the pocket where the photograph was whenever he was thinking hard about something. On the second day, she asked him about it, and he took the photograph out and showed her. "Nina," he said. "She is 18. She wants to study marine biology. She likes sharks specifically. She says sharks are proof that if something is built well enough, it doesn't need to change." He paused. "I think about that sometimes." Laura looked at the photograph and smiled. "She sounds like she would get along fine in this room." "She would eat this room alive," Ethan said, and he was smiling too. The tensions in the Grand Accord sessions were real and getting sharper. The Duran Collective and the Solican Empire had been in a slow, cold argument for decades over a stretch of inhabited systems near the edge of Solican territory. Both sides had history in those systems, both had losses tied to them, and neither side was wrong in a simple way. The human delegation was not central to this dispute. They were present as neutral observers and minor facilitators, but Ambassador Hadley followed every session with the focused attention of someone who understood that the wrong outcome here had consequences that would reach Earth eventually. Ethan followed it too. He was not required to, but he listened to every session and read every translated transcript in the evenings. He understood the shape of it. 2 very old wounds that had never properly healed, now being forced into the same room. He did not know if it was solvable. He did not know enough to say. But he watched the Empress Cyvale during the sessions and noticed something about her that the briefing files had not fully captured. She was patient in a way that was almost painful. She would listen to the Duran lead delegates say things that were clearly designed to provoke her, and she would be still. And then she would respond in a voice that was measured and quiet and completely without anger. It seemed to frustrate the Duran side more than any sharp reply would have. The insults toward Ethan continued. They were not constant, but they were regular enough to form a pattern. On the second afternoon, a Duran junior officer stepped directly in front of him in the line at the shared meal station, planting himself squarely in Ethan's path without a word or a glance, as if Ethan were simply not there. Ethan stepped to the side and waited. A nearby Vreth security officer watched and said nothing. On the third morning, that same Vreth officer, a tall, thick-necked figure named by his own delegation as Senior Guard Karuvas, passed Ethan in a corridor during a routine inspection and put a heavy hand on his shoulder. Not a friendly hand, a testing hand, the kind that presses down to see what gives. Ethan felt his bones protest the weight of it. He kept walking. He did not look up. He did not change his pace. Karuvas watched him go with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between contempt and something more complicated. Empress Sivale saw that moment from across the junction where her own guards had paused. She did not say anything, but she watched Ethan walk away from Karuvas without flinching, and something in her gaze shifted very slightly. She turned to Vorin, her senior personal aide, a lean and silver-templed Salakan elder who had served her for 20 years, and asked him quietly why the human did not respond. Vorin watched Ethan disappear around the far corner. "I am not certain," he said. "Find out what you can about him," the Empress said. Vorin nodded and said nothing further. He was good at that. That same night, Ethan was on the observation deck when Danny found him. The deck was a curved room on the outer ring of the station with a long transparent wall that looked directly into open space. The binary stars were both visible, one larger and more orange, one smaller and blue-white, and they cast a strange double light across everything. Danny sat down beside him on the low bench, and for a while they just looked at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" Danny asked eventually. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He was thinking about the photograph. He was thinking about sharks that did not change because they did not need to. He was thinking about what it meant to be the smallest name on a very large list, and to show up anyway, every morning, and stand in your corner of the room, and do the job that was yours to do. "I am thinking about what it means," he said at last, "to be the weakest one in a room, and to decide to keep showing up anyway." Danny looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at the stars. "I think it means something," he said. "I just can't say exactly what yet." "No," Ethan agreed. "Not yet." The binary stars burned quietly outside. The station hummed around them. Somewhere deeper inside the diplomatic wing, in a private chamber, Empress Sivale was reading a single-page summary that Vorin had prepared. At the top it said, "Corporal Ethan Cole, 4th Frontier Ranger Corps, cited twice for conduct under pressure. Volunteers for current posting on 12 hours notice." She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat with it, in the quiet, for a while. H1. They ridiculed the human's frailty until his sacrifice saved an alien empress. H2. The moment legends were born. HR. The 4th day of the conclave started quietly. The morning session had gone better than expected. Not resolved, not close to resolved, but calmer. The Duron lead delegate had said something that was almost a concession, wrapped in enough formal language that no one had to acknowledge it directly. And the Empress had responded in kind. Vorin had told Laura in a corridor afterward that this was how Solican diplomacy moved, slowly, sideways, in small steps that added up to something only in hindsight. Laura had relayed this to Ambassador Hadley, who had raised both eyebrows, which Danny said meant he was surprised and pleased at the same time. Ethan had spent the morning session at his post, watching the room, listening. During the short midday break, he went back to the human quarters, changed his collar insignia which had come loose, ate half a ration bar standing up, and reread the station layout diagram he had drawn from memory on his 3rd evening. He was not sure why he reread it. Habit, mostly. The way someone checks a door lock they have already checked, not because they doubt it, but because it costs nothing, and the alternative is to be the person who did not check. He was heading back toward the diplomatic wing when the first charge went off. He heard it before he felt it, a deep, hard sound that did not belong to anything normal, the kind of sound that does not echo so much as sit on top of everything else and flatten it. Then the floor moved under him, a single sharp jolt, and the corridor lights died, and the emergency lights came on in amber, turning the whole world the color of old copper. 3 seconds later, the second charge. Then the third. Ethan was already moving by the second one. He had his hand on the corridor wall, using it to stay upright as the station groaned around him. He pulled the small communications unit from his jacket and tried to reach Danny. Static. He tried the main delegation channel, static. He switched to the emergency band and got a broken, overlapping mess of voices in 4 different languages, none of them calm. He could pick out 2 things from the noise, the words East Wing and the word collapse. He started running. The east wing of the diplomatic level was 2 corridors away from where he had been standing. He knew the turns by memory, because he had walked them enough times in the past 3 days that his feet knew them without asking his brain. He took the first corner fast, stepping over a section of ceiling panel that had come down across the floor, and nearly ran into a pair of Solican station staff who were moving in the opposite direction, with the focused speed of people following an evacuation route. He pressed against the wall to let them pass, and kept moving. The second corridor told him the story before he reached the end of it. There was a door at the far end, the side entrance to the East Diplomatic Chamber where the Empress had been scheduled for a private review session that afternoon. The door was warped. Not dented, not damaged, warped. The whole frame pushed inward and sideways by the force of whatever had hit the floor below, bending the metal in a way that meant the door was not a door anymore. Around the door frame, thin smoke was moving in slow curls along the ceiling. He could also feel the air changing, not dramatically, not enough to knock him down, but there was a pressure difference between where he was standing and the section beyond the door. A subtle wrongness in the way the air pressed against his skin. He had felt something similar once before, during a training exercise in a partially decompressed module on Frontier Base. The training instructor had told them clearly what that feeling meant, and what it would do to any of them if they walked into it without a pressure suit or shielding. Ethan stood at the far end of the corridor, and felt it and understood it. He also heard, very faintly, through the warped door, a voice, low and steady, not panicked, giving instructions. He recognized the cadence even before he could make out the words. He had been listening to that voice for 4 days. He activated his communications unit again on every available channel and got nothing useful. He turned back the way he had come, ran to the nearest cross junction, and found Danny there, already running toward him from the other direction, face pale, holding a small damage readout panel that he had pulled from the wall further back. "Ethan," Danny said, and his voice was doing something it did not usually do. "The chamber, the Empress's session room, it is sealed. The pressure differential in that corridor is—" He looked at the panel, then back at Ethan. "Most species in there, their internal organs would not survive it. Not without shielding." "What about most species?" Ethan said. Danny looked at him. "Humans can take more of it. Not all of it. Enough of it to maybe." He stopped. "It would not be good for you either, Ethan. Badly." Ethan was already unclipping his personal shield emitter from his belt. He held it out to Danny. Danny stared at it. He did not take it right away. "Ethan, if I keep it, I might depend on it and stop paying attention to the pain," Ethan said. "The pain is information. I need it." This was not entirely true, and they both probably knew it, but it was a good enough reason to give someone who needed a reason. "Hold this. Do not follow me in." "What do you need from in there?" Danny said, and his voice had gone very quiet. Ethan had already turned back toward the corridor. He picked up a manual cutting tool from the fallen maintenance kit near the junction. A heavy, blunt instrument with a powered edge meant for emergency access work. He tested its weight in his hand. "Good. Solid. I need everyone who is in that room," he said, "to be out of it." Behind him, he heard Danny say his name once more, very quietly, the way you say something when you know the person has already decided, and you are not really trying to stop them anymore. You are just making sure they know they were seen before they go. Ethan did not look back. He walked into the pressure corridor with the cutting tool in both hands, and the amber emergency lights painting his shadow long and thin across the floor ahead of him. The pressure hit him in the first 3 steps. a thick, invisible weight in his ears, in his chest, behind his eyes. His nose started bleeding almost immediately. He blinked it away and kept walking, breathing slow and deliberate, the way his old ranger instructor had drilled into him. When your body screams, your mind leads. You count, and you keep counting, and you do not stop counting until the job is finished. He reached the door and raised the cutting tool and started to count. 1. They ridiculed the human's frailty until his sacrifice saved an alien empress. The moment legends were born. The override panel on the door was built for larger hands than his. That was the first problem. The access plate was designed for Solican engineers, whose fingers were longer and stronger, and the manual release required a specific sequence that Ethan had to figure out mostly by feel, because the emergency lighting above the door was flickering and unreliable. His fingers were already slippery. The pressure in the corridor was pushing fluid into places it was not supposed to be, and his hands were not working quite right. He noticed this the way he noticed the pain in his ears and the heaviness in his chest. He filed it, acknowledged it, and kept going. He talked himself through the process out loud. His voice came out rougher than usual, pressed flat by the air around him. Panel cover, lift from the lower edge. There it is. Release catch, left side, turn counterclockwise, not clockwise. You have done harder things than this. Keep going. Inside the chamber, Empress Sci-Fi heard him. She had been sitting on the floor near the center of the room, conserving her oxygen and keeping her breathing steady. Both of her guards, Olan and Sethra, were injured. Olan had a deep laceration across his upper arm, where a wall bracket had torn loose during the blast, and Sethra had something wrong with his legs that made standing impossible and movement very difficult. Vorin, her senior aide, was pinned under a section of collapsed ceiling panel that had come down at an angle. He was conscious and mostly unhurt, but the panel was too heavy for anyone still standing to lift alone, and Sethra could not stand. The Empress had assessed all of this in the first 60 seconds after the blast. She had applied basic pressure to Olan's wound with a strip of fabric she tore from the inner layer of her sleeve. She had spoken to Vorin quietly and steadily to keep him grounded. She had checked the ventilation panel on the lower wall and confirmed that something below it was burning. Not yet critically, but the smoke entering through the grate was slow and getting less slow. She was not panicked. Sci-Fi had ruled through a civil conflict, a succession crisis, and 2 border skirmishes in her 22 years as Empress. She understood emergencies. She knew the value of keeping the room around her calm, and she knew that she was the room. If she was steady, they were steadier. But she was also honest with herself, in the quiet way that people who carry great responsibility learn to be honest. She did not see a way out of this room before the smoke became a real problem, and her communications device had been destroyed in the initial blast. And both of the people who might have carried her weight were either pinned or injured. So when she heard the voice outside the door, a human voice, low and continuous, talking itself through something step by step, she closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she got up and walked to the door and placed her palm flat against it. "Whoever is there," she said, in her own language, "you do not have to do this." The voice on the other side paused. Then it continued, and what came back through the door was broken, accented, unpracticed, but recognizable. Solican, old dialect. The words were not perfect, but they were clear enough to understand. "Yes, I do. That is what humans are for." Vorin, pinned and listening from across the room, made a sound that was very quiet. "He has been studying the old dialect," he said, more to himself than anyone. "He has been studying it this whole time." The Empress said nothing. She kept her hand on the door and listened to the cutting tool working through the override panel, and she did not move away. It took Ethan 11 minutes to get the door open. Later, the station damage report would note that the door had sustained 40% structural deformation from the blast, and that the override panel had been partially fused by heat. That under normal circumstances, without specialist equipment, it would have taken a trained engineering crew significantly longer to breach. The report would not note what it cost the person who did it in 11 minutes, with a manual cutting tool and his bare hands, in a pressure corridor. That part was not in the official record. When the door finally groaned and gave way, Ethan pushed it open and stepped inside. He looked the way the pressure corridor had made him look, which was not good. The left side of his face was swollen around one eye, blood had dried in a dark line from his nose down to his jaw, and his breathing had a sound to it that was not quite right. He was holding the cutting tool with both hands, and his knuckles were split where the access panel had pushed back against his grip. He was upright, he was moving. He did not stop at the door. He did not look at the Empress first. He looked at the room. He assessed the room the way he had been trained to assess every room he walked into, and in 2 seconds he knew what needed to happen and in what order. He went to Vorin first. The ceiling panel was dense and heavy, pinning the old aide across the lower body at an angle. Ethan studied it for a moment, then crouched down and found the edge with the best leverage point, slid the flat end of the cutting tool beneath it, and used the length of the handle as a lever. His arms shook with the effort. The panel shifted, caught, and then lifted enough for Vorin to pull himself clear. Ethan held the position until Vorin was free, then let the panel back down in a controlled drop. He moved to Sethra next, helped the guard get upright using the wall for support, then got his good shoulder under Sethra's arm and moved him to the door. Then Olan, who could walk but was losing blood steadily. Ethan looped the guard's arm across his shoulders and walked him out with the same unhurried, deliberate pace. Then he went back in one more time. The Empress was standing exactly where he had left her, watching him. Her 4 eyes were open, all 4 of them, which was not the formal setting. She was reading him the way she read everything, completely and without pretense. Ethan crossed the room to her and stopped in front of her. He looked up at her. She was taller, as all Solikin were, and he held out his arm. The gesture was human, formal, the kind of thing you did when you were offering to walk someone somewhere safely. Cyvale looked at his arm. Then she looked at his face, the damage that the pressure corridor had left on it, the dried blood, the swollen eye, the way he was breathing. She looked at all of it, without looking away from any of it. Then she reached out and placed her hand in the crook of his offered arm. They walked to the door together. They walked through the corridor together, Ethan maintaining the same steady pace, never rushing, breathing through the pain of the differential again, now that he was carrying someone else's weight alongside his own. When they came out into the outer hallway, Danny was there, and Laura was already beside him before he could fully process that he had stopped walking. She was opening the medkit with fast, practiced hands, her voice low and steady, talking to him in the same way she always talked, direct and calm, and like she had already decided everything was going to be fine. He told her he was fine. She did not bother answering that. The 5 survivors sat along the outer corridor wall. Station emergency teams arrived a minute later, then 2 minutes after that, then in a wave. Ethan sat where Laura had put him and let her work and kept his eyes open, watching the corridor, watching the room, still on the job, even now, even like this. Karuvas arrived with the emergency wave. The big Vreth attaché, the one who had called Ethan a child made of paper, who had pressed a heavy hand onto his shoulder in the corridor, came through the far junction and stopped when he saw the 5 survivors sitting against the wall. He saw Olan and Sethra and Vorin and the Empress, and then he saw Ethan, and his face went through something complicated. He stood there for a long moment. He was a very large being who had survived many difficult things and who did not bow to anyone without a reason. Then he lowered his head. It was the full Vreth warrior's bow, chin to chest, held for a count of 3. The kind that in Vreth culture was reserved for acknowledging someone of genuine rank and courage. No one needed to. Ethan noticed it. He nodded once, very slightly, and said nothing, and looked back at the corridor. They ridiculed the human's frailty until his sacrifice saved an alien empress. The moment legends were born. The station took 4 days to stabilize after the attack. The Duaran radical faction, a splinter group operating without the knowledge or approval of the official collective delegation, was identified, tracked to a secondary docking bay on the lower levels, and apprehended by joint station security forces before they could reach their escape vessel. The 3 operatives who had planted the charges did not resist. They were taken into custody quietly and moved to a secure hold, and the official Duaran delegation issued a statement the same day that was 3 pages long and amounted to, in Laura's precise summary, complete horror and full cooperation. The conclave went on. This surprised almost everyone who had not been in that outer corridor when Ethan walked out of it. People who had expected the attack to end the sessions, to scatter the delegations back to their ships and leave the territorial dispute unresolved for another decade, found themselves watching instead as Empress Scyvale returned to the Grand Accord table on the second morning after the blast, and sat down and opened her notes and said in the quiet, measured voice she always used, "Let us continue." The Duran lead delegate sat across from her and looked at her for a long moment. He was a being who had spent a long career arguing with great force and volume. He looked at her face, and he looked at the empty chair beside her, where Varin usually sat. Varin was in the medical wing with 2 cracked ribs from the ceiling panel, and would be there another 3 days. And something in the lead delegate's expression shifted in a way that was hard to define, but easy to see. The sessions that followed were different from the ones before the attack. Not warmer, exactly. More honest. The Duran side began saying things directly that they had previously only said wrapped in formal language and careful qualification. The Solican side responded in kind. Ambassador Hadley watched from the human table and raised no eyebrows at all, which Danny said was the highest form of approval. Ethan was present for the first session back. His left eye was still partially swollen. His nose was taped where the medical team had worked on the pressure damage, and he had been told firmly by the station doctor that he needed to breathe slowly and avoid any further exertion for the next 2 weeks. He stood at his post beside the ambassador's chair and watched the room the same way he always watched it, steady and quiet and paying attention. Several delegates looked at him during that session, not the way they had looked at him before, not the glancing dismissive way, the way you look at background furniture. They looked at him directly, fully, the way you look at something that you have recalibrated your understanding of and are still in the process of recalibrating. Karuvas, the Vreth senior attaché, looked at him for a long time from across the hall. He did not look away when Ethan noticed. He held the gaze for a moment. Then he placed his right fist flat against his own chest. A Vreth gesture that Ethan recognized from the cultural briefing files. It meant roughly, "I see you as equal to me." It was not something the Vreth offered to other species often. Ethan held the Vreth's gaze and nodded once, with the same slight steadiness he brought to everything. The formal audience with Empress Scyvale happened on the 3rd day after the attack. Ethan received the request through official Solican diplomatic channels, a small sealed document delivered by one of the Empress's attendants to the human quarters, addressed specifically to him by name and rank. Laura read it over his shoulder and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Well, Ethan agreed. He arrived at the Empress's private receiving chamber at the requested time, dressed in the cleanest version of his uniform, his face still bandaged on the left side, his breathing still carrying that slight unevenness that the doctor said would take another week to fully resolve. He stood straight anyway. He always stood straight. The chamber was smaller than he expected. No formal arrangement of seats, no long table, no row of aides on either side. Just the room, and a few of her personal staff at a respectful distance, and Sci-Fi herself, standing near the window that looked out over the station ring, and the slow-turning stars beyond. She studied him with all four eyes, the way she had studied him in the East Chamber, fully, without pretense, without the formal diplomatic mask that went on in the Grand Hall. She asked him if he had been afraid. The question was direct and plain, and it deserved a direct and plain answer. Yes, Ethan said, the whole time. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked why he went in anyway. Ethan thought about that. He thought about Nina and her sharks, built well enough to not need to change. He thought about his ranger instructor telling him that when the body wants to quit, the mind leads. He thought about standing in the corridor with the pressure building around him and the cutting tool in his hands and the sound of voices on the other side of a sealed door. Because being afraid, he said, does not mean the thing in front of you stops needing to be done. Empress Sci-Fi was still. All four of her eyes were on him, and none of them moved. The room was very quiet. Then, she bowed. Not the shallow incline of formal diplomatic courtesy, the small gracious dip that heads of state offered one another to acknowledge shared status. A deep bow. A full bow. Chin toward the chest. Held. Deliberate. The kind of bow that in Sulacan culture was given from the greater to the lesser, only when the lesser had done something so significant that the difference in rank became for that moment the smaller truth. The staff along the wall went still. None of them had seen this in their lifetimes. There were records of it happening, in very old accounts, under very rare circumstances. It was not a gesture that Sulacan empresses made. When she straightened, her eyes were clear, and her voice was steady. She told Ethan that she had ruled 200 systems, that she had commanded fleets, and navigated political wars, and made decisions that shaped the lives of billions of beings. She told him that in all of that, she had encountered courage many times and in many forms, and she had learned to recognize it. She said that what he had done was the truest form of it she had ever seen, not because he was powerful, but because he was not, and he had gone anyway. She told him about a word, an old word, in the oldest form of the Sulacan language that had existed for thousands of years, and had grown rare because the kind of being it described was rare. Veyun, she said. The pronunciation was soft, the first syllable like a breath. She explained it carefully, the way you explain something important. It meant in its fullest sense, the one who is small enough to be overlooked and brave enough to walk into fire, regardless. She said the word had been fading from use for a long time. She said it would not fade anymore. Ethan stood very still for a moment. Then he said, in the old Sulacan dialect he had been practicing in the dark of his bunk for 3 days, "You honor me more than I can say." His grammar was not perfect. His accent was not native. It did not matter. Vauran, sitting in the medical wing a corridor away, and receiving a full account from one of the attendants, reportedly made a sound that was, for a 20-year veteran of Sulacan imperial service, extremely close to a laugh. The conclave closed 2 days later. The territorial dispute was not fully resolved. These things rarely were, in a single session. But it was significantly closer to resolution than it had been when the delegations arrived, and both sides had agreed on a framework for continued talks. Ambassador Hadley raised both eyebrows at the outcome. Danny declared it a victory, and then immediately corrected himself to a strong beginning, which Hadley apparently found acceptable. Ethan's last night on the station was quiet. He was on the observation deck again, the same bench, the same window, the same binary stars. Laura was there. Danny brought coffee that was, once again, not good, and handed it out, without apology. They sat together without talking much. Ethan had the photograph of Nina out, holding it loosely in one hand, looking at it, and then looking at the stars, and then back at it. His sister, laughing at something off to the left, in the Tucson summer. She did not know what had happened here. He would have to tell her, eventually, though he was not sure how to start that conversation. He thought, she is going to study sharks. She is going to do exactly what she decided to do, and she will be extraordinary at it, because that is what she is like. And somewhere out there, for reasons she will not fully understand until he explains them, an Empress of 200 star systems has borrowed a word from the oldest part of her own language and set it back into the world. He folded the photograph and put it back in his pocket. The station hummed around them. The stars outside burned on in the long, patient way of stars. In 40 diplomatic dispatches, in station logs and personal records, and the formal proceedings of the conclave, the word Veyun had already been written down dozens of times in the past 3 days. It was moving outward now, carried in reports, in conversations, in the accounts of delegates returning to their home systems. It would reach places Ethan had never been and would never go. It would be attached to a name and a species and a set of events that would be retold and discussed and argued over for longer than anyone in that observation room could meaningfully imagine. Karavas had said, the humans sent a child made of paper. He had not been wrong about what Ethan was made of. He had simply never learned, until now, what paper could endure, what paper, when it chooses to, can do in 22 minutes in a broken corridor with a cutting tool and a decision already made. What paper, when it burns, lights up everything around it. Somewhere in the galaxy, the word Veyun was already traveling, and it was carrying a human name with it into the dark.